What happens when a little girl riding her bike is reported as suspicious by HOA, only for the cop who shows up to be her own mother, the city's police chief? The sound of bicycle wheels rolling over fresh pavement cut through the warm air of a late Saturday afternoon in Huntersville, North Carolina. 10-year-old Simone Aldridge was circling her friend's block, standing up on the pedals every so often to feel the breeze catch her braids as they trailed behind her. She wasn't doing anything unusual, nothing more than what kids had done for decades, waiting outside a friend's house, riding in lazy loops, passing the time. But across the street, a pair of watchful eyes tracked her every move. From her spot on the porch, Janice Kettering tightened her grip around a glass of iced tea. Her lips pressed into a thin line, the way they always did when she thought she saw someone breaking the rules. As the head of the local homeowners association, Janice had built a reputation for pointing out overgrown lawns, cars parked too long on the curb, and garbage cans not pulled in by midnight. Neighbors might roll their eyes at her persistence, but most of them stayed quiet. Few wanted to get on her bad side. Yet this was different. To Janice, the sight of Simone circling the small roundabout near the clubhouse raised alarm bells she couldn't silence. She muttered under her breath, "She doesn't live here. Not on this side." Her mind jumped quickly, making Simone's simple act of biking into something far more suspicious. She reached for her phone. Simone had no idea she was being watched. Her focus was on the front door of her classmate, hoping her friend would come outside soon. She dragged her sneaker on the asphalt to stop, then balanced on the bike's frame while adjusting her shoelace. She hummed a tune from a show she liked, unaware that across the street, Janice was scrolling through her contacts for the non-emergency police line. "Huntersville Police Dispatch." The operator's voice answered after one ring. "Yes, hi," Janice began, her voice tight with urgency. "There's a girl riding around our clubhouse, circling like she doesn't belong." "I don't recognize her. She keeps looking around at the houses, like she's checking them." The operator asked for more details, and Janice leaned forward as though her scrutiny could prove her suspicions. "She's about 10 or 11, on a blue bike, black girl. She's been here at least 15 minutes, and we don't allow loitering around this area. Something isn't right." Simone leaned her bike against the curb and took a sip from her water bottle, completely unaware her presence was being described as a problem. Inside the house nearby, her friend was still asking her parents if she could go outside. Minutes stretched on, and Simone kicked a small pebble across the road, letting it bounce. 2 houses down, a couple standing by their car noticed the exchange. One neighbor on the phone, one child waiting quietly. The husband squinted. "What's Janice doing?" "That's just the Aldridge kid. She's friends with the Nguyen's daughter, isn't she?" His wife frowned, watching Janice's stiff posture. "Looks like she's calling the cops." "Over what? A bike ride?" The uneasiness settled in the air. Word spread quickly in neighborhoods like this, where everyone watched everyone else. Within minutes, blinds shifted, curtains pulled back, and more sets of eyes peeked at Simone, who had begun to notice the odd attention. She tugged her backpack tighter against her shoulder, suddenly less relaxed than before. Across the street, Janice snapped her phone shut, satisfied she had done her part. She crossed her legs and leaned back in the chair, waiting for what she believed would be swift confirmation. Simone glanced around and felt the stairs pressing against her. Her voice was small as she murmured to herself, "Why's everyone looking?" She had no idea that a call had already gone through, describing her as a suspicious figure in a neighborhood where she had come countless times to play. The subdivision was new, with rows of identical houses still smelling of fresh paint and sawdust. Families had only recently moved in, and cliques were already forming. Janice, with her clipboard presence and constant reminders of rules, had become an unspoken authority figure, one most people avoided rather than challenged. But today, her decision would bring consequences that no one in this cul-de-sac could have predicted. The sound of Simone's bike chain clicking filled the silence as she began pedaling again, slowly looping around. She thought about heading home, but she had promised her friend she'd wait. She didn't know that, a mile away, a cruiser had already been dispatched. The stage was set. A girl waiting for a friend, a woman certain she was protecting the neighborhood, and neighbors caught between disbelief and silence. The seconds ticked down before the first flashing lights would appear at the corner. The patrol car wasn't there yet, but the tension had already begun to build like static in the air. Simone could sense it now. She wasn't sure why, but every time she turned her handlebars, it felt like she was swimming through stairs. The clubhouse windows reflected her image back at her, and for a split second, she wondered if she really looked out of place. She pressed her lips together and muttered, "I'm just waiting for Mia." That's all across the street. Janice Kettering stayed glued to her porch seat. Her phone rested on the small patio table beside her, screen still lit from the call she had just made. She replayed her words in her head, feeling a strange satisfaction at having acted quickly. Her gaze didn't soften as she whispered to herself, "Better safe than sorry. That's what the rules are for." But the neighbors weren't as convinced. Mark and Elaine Porter, who had just finished unpacking groceries from their SUV, stood in the driveway, whispering, "She's waiting for Mia. Everybody knows that," Elaine said, glancing between Simone and Janice. "Yeah, but Janice," Mark trailed off, rubbing the back of his neck. "You know how she is. Rules are rules in her mind. Even kids waiting outside can look like loitering." "Loitering?" Elaine shot back in disbelief. "She's 10. Their voices were low, but Simone could tell something was off. She pushed her bike onto the grass and sat on the curb, tugging nervously at the strap of her backpack. The sound of birds chirping filled the silence, but it felt thin, as if the whole block was holding its breath. Meanwhile, Janice couldn't stop herself. She picked the phone back up and called dispatch again. "Yes, this is Janice Kettering. I just want to confirm that an officer is on the way." "Yes?" "Good, because she's still here. She's now sitting down, maybe casing the houses, just making sure someone's close." The dispatcher's tone was polite but clipped. "Ma'am, we have a unit responding. Please stay where you are." "Of course," Janice replied, crossing her arms with finality. Simone's heart began to beat faster as she noticed the faint red glow of a stoplight reflecting off the clubhouse windows. A car idled at the end of the street, engine humming. She thought about calling her mom, but she didn't want to worry her. Her mom had told her so many times, "If you're ever waiting for someone, just be patient. Don't wander off." So she stayed put, even though the air now felt heavier, thicker, harder to sit in. From down the block, another voice joined in. It was Mr. Dwyer, an older neighbor watering his flower beds. "What's going on here?" he called out, his accent thick from years of living in Massachusetts before retiring to North Carolina. Mark answered with a shake of his head. "Janice called the cops on Simone." Mr. Dwyer turned off the hose and blinked in disbelief. "For what? For being a kid?" Janice heard him, but she refused to engage. Her focus was fixed straight ahead, eyes sharp. To her, this wasn't about a child's bike ride. It was about order, the kind of order she believed she was entitled to enforce. Inside Mia and Gwen's house, the friend Simone had been waiting for was finally tying her sneakers. She was excited, ready to run out and ride bikes. But her mother, peeking through the blinds, caught sight of the scene outside, the girl on the curb looking uneasy, Janice sitting like a watchtower, and a slow ripple of neighbors gathering. "Not yet," Mrs. Nguyen said, putting a hand on Mia's shoulder. "Something's happening. Stay here." Mia's face fell. "But why?" "Simone's waiting." Her mother didn't answer, just pressed her lips together, uncertain of what would come next. At that moment, the low rumble of an engine broke through the neighborhood. A patrol car turned the corner, its lights flashing in the late afternoon sun. Simone's eyes widened. Her stomach flipped. For a second, she thought someone else must have called for help. She looked around, confused. But when the car slowed, pulling up to the curb where she sat, the realization washed over her. The car door opened with a soft creak, and a pair of boots hit the pavement. Neighbors leaned forward, some curious, some worried, others whispering. The moment Janice had been waiting for had arrived. She straightened her posture, smoothing the front of her blouse as though she were the one in charge. But the person stepping out of that cruiser wasn't a beat cop taking routine calls. It was Chief Renata Collins, Simone's mother. Her uniform carried weight, her presence undeniable. And for a heartbeat, silence fell across the street, like the neighborhood itself realized what had just happened. Simone exhaled in relief, whispering under her breath, "Mom." But the relief in her voice was only the beginning, because the collision between assumption and truth was about to play out in front of every neighbor watching. The cruiser's lights painted a faint red and blue against the beige siding of the homes. They weren't blaring sirens, but it was enough to grab the neighborhood's full attention. Curtains swayed as people peeked through windows. Garage doors cracked open as folks stepped out with folded arms, pretending to water plants or collect mail. Huntersville was the kind of place where anything unusual drew a crowd fast, and this was already shaping up to be more than unusual. Chief Renata Collins closed the car door slowly, her uniform catching the sunlight, her badge gleaming against the dark fabric. She wasn't rushing. She didn't need to. Her steady walk toward her daughter was deliberate, each step layered with the calm confidence of someone who had faced far more chaotic scenes than this. Yet for Simone, it was the best sight she could imagine. She stood quickly, her bike clattering to the ground as she called out, "Mom!" Renata gave a small smile, her eyes softening as she glanced at her daughter. "You okay, baby girl?" Simone nodded quickly, though her voice cracked as she admitted, "People keep staring at me. I didn't do anything. You don't have to explain yourself." Renata assured her, one hand resting lightly on Simone's shoulder. But then her eyes lifted, locking on Janice Kettering across the street. Janice sat straighter in her porch chair, suddenly caught in the spotlight of silence. She hadn't expected this outcome. She expected an officer to arrive, maybe question the child, maybe even escort her away. What she hadn't counted on was the girl's mother stepping out as the top cop of the city. Still, Janice wasn't one to retreat easily. She called out, her voice firm. "Officer. Oh, Chief, I'm glad you're here. We've had some concerns." The neighbors shifted, their expressions a mix of disbelief and discomfort. Elaine Porter whispered to her husband, "Did she really just say that, after all this?" Renata didn't rush her words. She let the silence drag just long enough to hold control of the moment. Then she answered, "And what concerns are those, Miss Kettering?" Janice adjusted her blouse again, flustered but determined. "This child was circling the clubhouse repeatedly. It looked suspicious. We've had incidents in neighborhoods before, and I wasn't about to let something happen here. I was doing my duty as an HOA member." Simone's small voice cut in, trembling but clear. "I was just waiting for Mia. She said she'd come out and ride bikes." Murmurs rolled through the small crowd now forming near the sidewalk. Mr. Dwyer, the retired neighbor, shook his head and muttered loud enough for people to hear. "Suspicious? She's a kid with a backpack. That's not suspicious. That's childhood." Renata's jaw stayed steady, but her tone shifted. Still calm, but sharper, like a scalpel cutting through noise. "Ms. Kettering, you called my officers to report a child waiting for her friend. You described her as suspicious for sitting on a curb with a bicycle. Do you understand the weight of that?" Janice faltered, then crossed her arms defensively. "I was protecting the neighborhood. It wasn't about her being a child. It was about behavior, but her words didn't carry the strength she wanted them to. Around her, the looks on neighbors' faces told a different story. Some skeptical, some embarrassed, others downright angry. Elaine raised her voice now, unable to stay quiet. "You knew exactly what you were implying, Janice. Don't stand there pretending otherwise." Mark tried to hush his wife, but she pulled her arm away. "No, I'm tired of this." We all tiptoe around her rules and her complaints. And now she's dragging a 10-year-old into it? No. Renata glanced briefly at Elaine, then back at Janice. "What do you think would have happened if another officer had shown up instead of me? What story would have been written about this child? What headline could have come from it? Did you think about that before you dialed?" The silence that followed was heavier than before. Simone clutched her mom's hand, looking up with wide eyes. She didn't understand all the implications, but she understood enough to know she'd been singled out. Her small voice broke the quiet again. "Why would she call the police on me?" Renata crouched down beside her, brushing a braid from her face. "Sometimes people don't see the whole picture, sweetheart. Sometimes they jump to conclusions." The crowd wasn't dispersing. If anything, more neighbors were drifting closer, their presence pressing on Janice like the words landed with a force that silenced even the whispers. Nobody moved for several seconds. The air was charged, not with noise, but with truth laid bare in front of everyone. But the confrontation had only just begun, and soon voices from the crowd would turn this standoff into a community reckoning. The flashing lights painted streaks of red and blue across the freshly paved street, reflecting off the rows of polished SUVs parked neatly in driveways. The cruiser sat quietly now, its presence enough to keep every eye locked on the scene. What had begun with a single phone call had grown into something larger. Neighbors who barely spoke on normal days were now lingering at the edge of their lawns, whispering, crossing their arms, and waiting to see what would happen. Simone shifted her weight from one sneaker to the other, still gripping her mother's hand tightly. The sight of the police car had frightened her at first, but when she realized her mom was the one behind the wheel, relief flooded in. Still, the relief carried a shadow, because everyone was still staring at her as though she were the problem. Renata Collins, standing tall in her uniform, was used to being watched. But here, in her own daughter's friend's neighborhood, it struck differently. She scanned the cluster of neighbors, noting the split expressions. Some curious, some supportive, others blank, as if waiting for a verdict. Her voice was steady, meant for everyone to hear. There is no emergency here. There never was. For a moment, that should have been the end of it. But Janice Kettering leaned forward in her porch chair, unwilling to let go. Chief Collins, with all due respect, we have to take these things seriously. I've lived in neighborhoods where children would scout houses before things went missing. Gasps rippled through the group. Simone's grip on her mother's hand tightened. Scout houses? She whispered, not fully understanding but sensing the insult. Renata turned her head slowly toward Janice, her eyes sharp but calm. That is an accusation you don't get to make against a 10-year-old girl who was waiting for her friend. You escalated something that never needed escalation. And now, look at what you've done. You've turned your own neighbors into witnesses of a mistake. The tension was so thick that when a car door slammed at the end of the street, several people flinched. It was another family arriving home, unaware of the drama until they stepped out and saw the lights, the crowd, and the chief of police standing at the center of it all. They froze, groceries in hand, trying to piece together what they had just walked into. Mark Porter finally spoke up, his voice carrying across the street. Janice, this is embarrassing. Everyone here knows Simone. She's been to the Nguyen's place plenty of times. My own kids play with her. You had no reason to call. Janice's eyes flickered toward him, her jaw tight. I did what I thought was necessary. If no harm was done, then why are you all acting like I'm the villain here? Elaine Porter snapped back, louder than she intended. Because you turned a child into a suspect in her own friend's neighborhood. And now her mother, our chief of police, had to show up just to set you straight. Renata didn't smile, but she allowed the words to hang. She didn't need to add to them just yet. The neighbors were doing that work themselves. Simone's eyes darted toward Mia's house. She spotted her friend at the window, face pressed against the glass. She gave a small wave, but Mia didn't wave back. She looked too nervous, her parents keeping her inside as though letting her out would drop her into the middle of a storm. Simone's shoulders sagged. I just wanted to ride bikes, she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. Her mother heard it, though, and bent down slightly. I know, sweetheart. That's all you were doing. The quiet honesty of that moment cut through the murmurs. Some of the neighbors looked down at their shoes, suddenly uncomfortable with their own silence. They hadn't made the call, but they hadn't stopped it either. They had watched, waiting, letting Janice's version of events carry weight until Renata arrived and shattered it. Janice shifted in her chair again, her composure slipping. She began, but her words caught in her throat. Renata's voice cut gently across her attempt. Think carefully before you continue, because every word you say, now, tells this community who you are, and they are listening. The pause that followed stretched long. Somewhere, a dog barked in the distance, then went quiet. Every eye was on Janice, waiting. She swallowed, unable to find the same authority she'd clung to before. Simone, sensing the shift, leaned against her mother. Her voice was barely a whisper, but it carried far enough. Can we go home now? Renata glanced around at the cluster of neighbors and nodded. Soon. But first, people need to hear what happens when assumptions turn into accusations. But before that truth could settle, more voices from the crowd would rise, adding layers to the tension and forcing everyone to confront where they stood. The street had taken on the atmosphere of a stage play, every driveway a balcony seat, every whisper a line of commentary. The cruiser's lights still pulsed, though softer now, fading into the background as the real focus locked on Renata Collins. She stood beside her daughter, posture straight, voice measured, uniform sharp. She wasn't there as a neighbor anymore. She was there as the chief, carrying the weight of her badge not just for Simone, but for everyone who might have been in her place. Simone clung to her mother's hand, her eyes wide and questioning. The bike lay on its side a few feet away, forgotten in the tension. "Mom," she asked quietly, "why'd she call you?" Renata's voice softened only for her child, because she thought something that wasn't true. That happens sometimes, and we'll talk more about it later. Right now, I just need you to stand tall, because you've done nothing wrong. Simone nodded, though her small frame trembled under the weight of so many eyes. Across the street, Janice Kettering rose from her porch chair at last. The iced tea she'd set aside had already left a wet ring on the table, a silent witness to her certainty only minutes ago. She smoothed her skirt and stepped closer to the curb, chin high. "Chief Collins," she began, using the title heavily, as though reminding the crowd of who she was speaking to, "you have to understand my perspective. I've been entrusted with maintaining order here. When I see something out of place, I report it. That's my job." Renata didn't flinch. "And you believe a 10-year-old girl on a bicycle is out of place?" Janice hesitated, her eyes flickering toward the gathering of neighbors before snapping back. It wasn't about her being a child. It was about behavior. Circling, loitering, waiting. We've all heard stories. It's not paranoia to be cautious. Elaine Porter, still standing in her driveway, folded her arms tighter. Cautious doesn't mean calling the cops on a kid you see every week. You've waved to Simone before, Janice. Don't act like she's a stranger. The ripple of agreement through the small crowd was audible. Soft murmurs, nods of recognition. Mr. Dwyer muttered again, louder this time. "This isn't Boston, and she isn't casing houses. She's a child." Period. Janice's lips pressed into a thin line. Her authority was slipping, and she felt it. Renata took a slow step forward, her voice dropping just enough to sharpen the edge. "You made a report that could have gone very differently. If another officer had arrived, one who didn't know Simone, what do you think might have happened? What might have been written into the record? What story would be circulating right now?" Silence answered her. Simone glanced up at her mother, then at Janice, and finally found her own voice. "I was waiting for Mia. I wasn't doing anything wrong. You didn't even ask me." Her words landed harder than any uniformed authority could. They cut through the crowd like a bell. Several neighbors shifted uncomfortably, ashamed at the truth spoken so plainly by a child. Renata placed a hand gently on Simone's shoulder, steadying her. Then she looked at Janice again. "You didn't speak to her. You didn't ask a question. You went straight to treating her like a problem. And that decision says more about you than it does about her." Janice opened her mouth, but no sound came out. For once, she found herself without a rule book to hold up, without a regulation to cite. Mark Porter stepped in, voice steady now. "We all live here together. If you think something's wrong, you talk first. You don't escalate." "We can't live in fear of each other," Elaine added sharply. "Especially not fear of children." The murmurs grew louder, a chorus of agreement rising around the cul-de-sac. Neighbors who had stayed quiet about Janice's past complaints were finding their voices now. And with each word, the balance of power shifted further away from her. Simone's friend Mia cracked the door of her house open at last, her face peeking out. "Simone?" she called, voice timid. Renata motioned gently for Simone to wait, then addressed the crowd one last time. "This should be a lesson. Every action we take, every assumption we make, it has consequences. For children, for families, for communities. I hope everyone here remembers that the next time you think about dialing that number." The neighbors grew quiet again, her words lingering like a weight they could. The air on Magnolia Trace Drive had grown thick, heavy with the weight of every eye fixed on the standoff. Renata Collins stood centered, her daughter close at her side, while Janice Kettering hovered near the curb, still clinging to her sense of authority but visibly shaken. The silence was beginning to crack, tension spilling over as neighbors shuffled, exchanged looks, and whispered just loud enough for fragments to carry. Finally, it was Simone who spoke again, her voice trembling yet strong enough to carry across the yard. "You didn't even ask me why I was here?" "You just called the police." That statement hit like a stone thrown into water, ripples of discomfort spreading out among the crowd. Mia Nguyen's door creaked wider as she finally stepped outside, her parents hovering protectively behind her. She jogged towards Simone, calling, "I told you I'd be quick!" "Sorry it took so long." The two girls hugged instinctively, a small act of innocence standing in stark contrast to the adult drama unraveling around them. Renata looked down at her daughter with pride, but also pain, knowing how much strength it took for a child to defend her own presence. Janice cleared her throat, trying to regain ground. "Chief Collins, no one is questioning your daughter's character. I'm simply saying that I saw something unusual, and in today's world we can't be too careful." Renata turned her gaze fully on Janice. Her voice was calm, deliberate. "Let me be very clear. When you use words like suspicious to describe a 10-year-old waiting for her friend, you're not protecting your neighborhood, you're profiling your neighbors. And that's dangerous." Gasps and murmurs followed. Elaine Porter took a step forward, unable to hold her tongue any longer. "Janice, you've written letters for trash bins being out too long. You've scolded families for chalk drawings on sidewalks. But this is different. This isn't about bylaws. This is about how you see people." Janice bristled. "I enforce rules equally," Mr. Dwyer interrupted, shaking his head. "No, you don't. You saw what you wanted to see, and you made a call that could have ended badly. And the fact that the chief had to spell it out for you tells us everything." The crowd shifted closer now, no longer just spectators, but participants. Mark Porter raised his voice over the growing buzz. "You made Simone feel like she didn't belong. And that's unforgivable." Renata finally let her authority fill the space, her tone commanding without ever rising. "Do you understand the risk you created, Ms. Kettering?" Another officer might have arrived with only your words to go on. Suspicious child circling houses. That could have escalated in ways you can't even imagine. A young girl could have been handcuffed, questioned, traumatized, all because you made assumptions. Simone pressed against her mother's side, her small voice breaking through again. "Mom, what would have happened if it wasn't you?" Renata exhaled slowly, the weight of her daughter's question pressing harder than any neighbor's judgment. She crouched to Simone's level, her voice tender but honest. "It could have gone very differently, sweetheart. That's why this matters so much. That's why we're having this conversation right here." The crowd was silent, hanging on her words. Even the children peeking from behind their parents stayed quiet, sensing the gravity of the moment. Janice's confidence cracked further, but she still clung to her defense. "So what, you're saying I should just ignore things that seem off?" "No," Renata replied firmly. "I'm saying you should think before you label your neighbors as threats. Ask questions. Use your judgment with compassion, not suspicion. There's a difference between protecting and targeting, and you crossed it." Elaine's voice cut in again, sharper now. "And the worst part? You've lived here long enough to know Simone. You knew exactly who she was." That comment drew nods from several people in the crowd. A father standing near his garage spoke up. "My kids ride around here all the time. No one's ever called the police on them. So what made this so different, Janice?" The unspoken answer hung in the air, too loud to ignore. Janice's face reddened, her composure unraveling in the gaze of her neighbors. She stammered, I was thinking of everyone's safety." Renata straightened, her hand steady on Simone's shoulder. "Safety isn't served by suspicion rooted in bias. It's served by community, by knowing your neighbors, respecting them, treating them fairly. If you want to talk about safety, start there." The silence that followed was heavier than before. The cul-de-sac was no longer just a backdrop. It had become a courtroom. Neighbors lined the sidewalks, some with arms folded tight, others gesturing animatedly as whispers turned into debates. The confrontation had grown larger than Simone, larger than Janice. It was now a question of where everyone stood. Elaine Porter raised her voice first, frustration breaking through. We can't keep pretending this is about bylaws or rules. It's about how you treat people, Janice, and I'm tired of staying quiet. Her husband Mark tried to steady her tone, but even he nodded. She's right. This isn't the first time you've overstepped. Everyone knows it. From the edge of the crowd, a man in a Carolina Panthers cap spoke up. I've lived here 2 years, and I've seen you walk the block like you're patrolling. You scare my kids when they leave their basketball hoop out. That's not community. That's control. Janice's shoulders stiffened, but she snapped back. I've only ever done what's necessary to keep this place safe and respectable. Someone has to maintain standards. Without me, you'd have chaos. That comment drew groans and scoffs. Elaine laughed bitterly. Chaos? You mean kids playing chalk games and families leaving bikes in driveways? That's called life. Janice Renata didn't move from her spot, but she watched carefully, letting the community air its grievances. Simone leaned closer to her mother and whispered, They're all fighting now. I know, Renata whispered back. But sometimes the truth has to come out, even if it's messy. On the opposite sidewalk, Mrs. Nguyen finally stepped forward, Mia's mother, who had been holding back until now. Her voice was calm, but resolute. Janice, I kept my daughter inside because I was afraid. Afraid of what your phone call would bring down on Simone, and by extension, on all of our kids. Do you realize what that means? I was more afraid of a neighbor's suspicion than of anything else. Her words settled on the crowd like a hammer, a mother admitting fear, not of crime, but of her own community's actions. Mia clutched her mother's hand, glancing worriedly between the adults. A neighbor named Carlos Rivera, who lived at the far end of the block, raised his voice next. You've complained about my truck, Janice. You said it was too loud, too visible. Now I see what it's really about. It was never just the rules. It's who you think fits here and who doesn't. The tension sharpened instantly. Half the crowd nodded in agreement, while a smaller cluster looked uneasy, unwilling to openly challenge Janice, but not ready to side against her either. Janice's voice cracked as she defended herself. This is outrageous. I treat everyone equally. I don't care about background, I care about rules. Renata finally cut in, her voice strong enough to silence the scattered arguments. Then listen closely. Rules mean nothing if they're enforced without fairness, without context, and without humanity. You called in law enforcement for a child, and now you've turned your neighborhood into a divided street. That's not order. That's harm. Simone squeezed her mother's hand tighter, her young voice trembling, but clear. I just wanted to ride my bike. I didn't want all this. The simplicity of her words pierced the noise. For a brief moment, the crowd quieted, their anger dissolving into shame. Several neighbors lowered their eyes, uncomfortable at being part of a scene that had spiraled so far from where it began. But the divide was still there, palpable. Some were firmly against Janice now, calling her actions what they were. Others hovered in silence, unwilling to admit their own complicity in letting things go this far. And Janice herself stood rigid, her face pale, but her pride unyielding. Elaine spoke again, her tone softer but still firm. We're neighbors, Janice. We should be looking out for each other's kids, not turning them into suspects. That's what's been lost here. Renata let the words hang, then added her own. This isn't just about today. It's about what kind of neighborhood you want to live in. Fear will rot it from the inside. Compassion will hold it together. The choice is yours. Simone looked around at the faces. Some ashamed, some angry, some uncertain. She realized in that moment that adults didn't always know better, that even grown-ups could lose sight of. The murmurs had quieted, but the tension hadn't eased. It clung to the street like thick summer air, everyone waiting for what Chief Renata Collins would say next. She didn't rush. She let the weight of the moment press down before stepping forward, her boots firm against the pavement. Her hand stayed steady on Simone's shoulder, anchoring her daughter while her voice carried across every porch and driveway. Let me tell you all something, Renata began, her tone calm but laced with the authority of years in uniform. I've seen calls like this before. Calls where someone thinks they're just reporting suspicious behavior, when in reality, they're reporting a child being a child. And I've seen the consequences when the responding officer doesn't know the difference. The crowd was silent, hanging on her words. Even the kids who'd been whispering among themselves stopped fidgeting, sensing something heavy was coming. Renata glanced down at Simone, then back to her neighbors. You don't forget those cases. You don't forget the fear in a child's eyes when they're treated like a suspect instead of someone's son or daughter. You don't forget the parents begging for answers. And you don't forget the way a single phone call can change the course of someone's life forever. Janice shifted uneasily, her arms crossed, but she said nothing. Renata's voice lowered slightly, drawing everyone closer even as she stayed rooted. When I got that dispatch call, I heard the description. Suspicious girl on a bicycle, circling houses, black child, 10 or 11. Do you understand what that sounds like? Do you understand how easily that could have gone wrong? A shiver ran through the crowd, not from weather, but from realization. Mrs. Nguyen pressed her daughter Mia closer to her side, whispering something only she could hear. Simone whispered up to her mum. Why would she say that? I wasn't doing anything. Renata brushed her thumb gently against her daughter's shoulder. Because sometimes, people see what they expect instead of what's real. The words cut sharp and clean. A few neighbors exchanged guilty glances, as if recalling moments of their own where they had stayed silent, where they had let Janice's complaints go unchallenged, where they had avoided conflict instead of confronting it. Mr. Dwyer, who had been standing near his flower beds earlier, raised his voice again. She's right. We can't keep letting this slide. If a kid waiting for her friend is suddenly suspicious, then what does that say about us? About this street? Elaine Porter followed quickly, her tone filled with conviction. It says we've given Janice too much power, and it says we haven't stood up for what's right when it mattered. The words seemed to strike Janice, who bristled but still held her ground. I only made a call. No one got hurt. Renata turned toward her fully now, her voice cutting firm but still controlled. No one got hurt today, Janice. But that was luck. Luck that I was the one who showed up. Luck that this didn't end with a little girl in handcuffs or a news story that none of us could take back. Do you want to rely on luck when it comes to children's lives? Janice faltered, her face betraying doubt she refused to admit out loud. Simone tugged lightly at her mother's sleeve, whispering, Would they really have put me in handcuffs? Renata crouched down to meet her eyes, her voice soft but honest. Sometimes, sweetheart, sometimes officers don't know the full story, and they make choices they can't undo. That's why it's so important we speak up now, before it happens again. The crowd stayed quiet, the weight of her words pressing on each person differently. Some felt shame, some felt anger. Some felt the fragile sting of recognition, knowing they had overlooked things before. Carlos Rivera broke the silence, his voice carrying across the group. So what do we do, Chief? Because it can't just be about Janice. This neighborhood, this community, we all let this happen. Renata nodded slowly, acknowledging the truth in his words. You start by looking inward. Ask yourself what assumptions you carry, what stories you believe before you know the facts. And when you see something like this happening, when a neighbor is being unfairly targeted, you don't stay quiet. Silence makes you complicit. Simone leaned against her mom, her small voice filled with more strength than before. I just want people to treat me the same as Mia, or the same as anyone. Her words, innocent yet piercing, landed with a weight heavier than all the lectures combined. Neighbors looked at her, really looked, and saw not a suspect, not a problem, but a 10-year-old girl asking for something so basic it should never have been questioned. Renata let the silence stretch again, giving her daughter's words space to breathe. Then she straightened, her gaze sweeping across the cul-de-sac. So the question is simple. What kind of neighborhood do you want to live in? One that jumps to suspicion? Or one that chooses fairness, compassion, and responsibility? The air was thick, but no one looked away. For the first time, it felt like the divide wasn't just about Janice versus the rest. It was about every single person standing there, deciding who they wanted to be moving forward. But change doesn't come without conflict, and before the night ended, this lesson would leave a mark on everyone, some with shame, others with resolve. The sun had slipped lower, casting long shadows across the cul-de-sac. What started as a Saturday afternoon bike ride had stretched into a neighborhood reckoning, and the weight of it lingered in the air. Neighbors no longer pretended to be casual onlookers. They stood openly now, leaning against mailboxes, gathering in small clusters, speaking in hushed tones as if afraid their words might carry farther than intended. Simone sat back on her bike seat, one sneaker on the ground, trying to shrink herself against all the attention. She wanted so badly for the ground to swallow her up, for everything to rewind to the moment she first rang Mia's doorbell. But her mum's hand stayed firm on her shoulder, a reminder that she wasn't alone, that her voice had mattered even when it trembled. Janice Kettering, still planted on her porch, had shrunk in stature without moving an inch. Her usual sharpness, the certainty that made neighbors duck when she walked down the block with a clipboard, had dulled. She looked around and saw not quiet compliance, but judgment staring back at her. For once, her authority didn't hold. Renata broke the quiet first. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried. There are two ways this street can move forward. We can pretend this never happened, chalk it up as a misunderstanding, and let the same patterns repeat. Or we can take this moment for what it is, a reminder that the smallest decisions, even one phone call, can have consequences far bigger than we realize. Elaine nodded quickly, adding, "She's right. If we don't change after this, then what's the point of watching it happen?" Carlos Rivera crossed his arms but spoke firmly. "Change means accountability. It means we stop letting things slide. Not just Janice, but any of us. If you see bias driving someone's actions, you call it out." Janice's voice cracked as she finally spoke, softer than anyone had heard before. "I didn't mean for this to happen. I didn't mean to hurt her." All eyes swung back to her. Elaine shook her head. "Intent doesn't erase impact. You may not have meant harm, but Simone still felt it. We all felt it." Simone's small voice carried again. "You made me feel like I wasn't supposed to be here." That admission cut deeper than any adult reprimand. Even Janice couldn't look away from the 10-year-old's eyes. She swallowed hard, the pride she had leaned on for years slipping from her grip. I'm sorry," she said at last, though the words came out stiff, unfamiliar on her tongue. Renata studied her, then gave a single nod. "That's a start. But an apology only matters if it changes behavior." The crowd was restless, some wanting more, some satisfied that the message had been made clear. Mia finally stepped forward, holding Simone's hand tightly. "She's my friend. She belongs here." It was such a simple declaration, but it carried a power that pulled at the tension in the air. A child naming what adults had complicated. Renata glanced around the circle of neighbors. "Every one of you has a choice. You can be the kind of community that guards against shadows that don't exist, or you can be the kind of community that protects each other, uplifts each other, and treats every child here like your own. It's not about bylaws. It's about humanity." The words sat heavy, but something shifted. A few neighbors murmured agreement, others nodded solemnly, and some simply stood in silence, processing. For the first time, the divide didn't feel like an open wound. It felt like the first step of healing, slow, awkward, fragile, but possible. Janice turned away at last, sinking back into her chair, her authority stripped. She stared at her untouched glass of iced tea, condensation dripping down the sides. For once, she had nothing left to say. Simone tugged her mother's sleeve again. "Can we go home now?" Renata bent low, kissed her daughter's temple and whispered, "Yes, sweetheart, you've been brave enough for one day." As they walked toward the cruiser, Simone pushing her bike alongside, neighbors moved slightly to clear the path. Some offered small nods of respect to Renata, others gave Simone soft smiles of encouragement. Not everyone, but enough to mark the difference. The flashing lights dimmed as Renata reached in and turned them off. The neighborhood sank into its ordinary sounds again. Lawn sprinklers ticking, a dog barking in the distance, the faint hum of cicadas. But it didn't feel the same. Something had shifted in the soil of that street, something that couldn't be unseen or undone. But before the evening ended, One final reflection would tie this story together, a lesson meant to last far longer than a single afternoon. By the time the cruiser rolled quietly down the street, the crowd had already begun to scatter. Garage doors rattled shut, blinds lowered again, and neighbors drifted back to their homes, carrying with them more than idle gossip. They carried a lesson, one they couldn't quite shake, even as the evening settled back into its normal rhythm. For Simone, the moment would never be just another Saturday. As she climbed into the back seat of her mom's cruiser with her bike tucked carefully beside her, she whispered, "Will it happen again?" Renata glanced at her daughter through the rearview mirror, her eyes steady but gentle. "It might, baby girl. But what matters is how we respond. You don't let someone else's fear or bias define who you are. You know your worth, and you stand tall in it." Simone leaned her cheek against the window, her reflection staring back at her. She thought about the stares, the whispers, and the way her chest had tightened when she saw the flashing lights. But she also thought about Mia running toward her, about her mom standing firm, about neighbors who finally spoke up. In her young heart, the confusion of fear was tangled with a new understanding of strength. Back on Magnolia Trace Drive, Janice Kettering remained on her porch long after the crowd dispersed. The iced tea glass had gone warm, condensation drying into a ring. She replayed every word, every look, every moment she'd been forced to confront herself in front of the community she once ruled by rules alone. For the first time in years, she wasn't sure if she could walk down her own street without feeling eyes on her. Not the deferential kind, but the kind that measured, questioned, judged. Inside the Porter home, Elaine spoke softly as she tucked her kids into bed. "What you saw today, that wasn't right, but it's up to all of us to make it better. Never be afraid to speak up when someone is treated unfairly. No matter who it is." Her children nodded, eyes wide, perhaps not fully grasping the weight of the day, but understanding enough to know that something important had happened. Carlos Rivera sat at his kitchen table, hands clasped, staring out the window at the darkened street. His truck sat in the driveway, just as it always had. For years he had felt like his choices were scrutinized, his presence tolerated but not fully accepted. Tonight confirmed what he had suspected all along. But it also gave him a resolve he hadn't felt before. If Janice's authority was cracking, maybe there was room for something better to take root. And as for the Nguyen's, Mia hugged Simone tight before they parted, her voice firm for a girl her age. "You belong here. Don't ever think you don't." Those words echoed in Simone's ears as her mother drove them home. She let herself believe them, even as doubt nibbled at the edges. The lesson wasn't about bylaws. It wasn't about neighborhood watch. It was about how fragile trust could be, how easily suspicion could poison it, and how much courage it took to rebuild it. It was about the responsibility every neighbor carried, not to treat children as suspects, not to let silence do the work of injustice, but to choose fairness, compassion, and courage, even when it was uncomfortable. Renata knew the day's events would ripple beyond her daughter. Tomorrow, conversations would happen on porches and at kitchen tables. Some neighbors would feel defensive, others ashamed, and a few quietly relieved that someone had finally said what needed saying. But for her, the work was far from over. She carried not only the role of a mother but the badge of chief, a reminder that justice didn't begin in a courthouse. It began on streets like this one, in the smallest moments that revealed who people truly were. As the cruiser pulled into their driveway, Renata turned the ignition off and sat in the quiet for a moment. She reached back and took her daughter's hand. "You were brave today, Simone. Remember that. Never let anyone make you feel less than you are." Simone smiled faintly, her voice soft but steady. "I won't, Mom." And for the first time all day, Renata believed her. Stories like this don't end neatly. They leave questions, discomfort, and a challenge for everyone who witnessed them. What kind of neighbor do you want to be? The kind who calls in suspicion, or the kind who stands up for fairness? That choice doesn't just belong to Janice, or to Renata. It belongs to all of us. So if this story moved you, if it made you stop and think about the kind of community we build every day with our actions, then don't just let it fade into the background. carry the lesson with you, and speak up when silence feels easier. And if you want to hear more stories that challenge, that reveal truths, and that leave us better than we were before, make sure to subscribe. Because the conversations we avoid are often the ones we need most. This isn't just Simone's story. It's a story for every street, every neighbor, every child. What happens next depends on us.